Hey everybody, welcome back to the Earthmote. I am Randall. Today I have another book review for you / kind of GM theory or prep advice. Today we're going to be taking a look at Sly Flourish's The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, written by Mike Shea, also known as Sly Flourish. I bought this book when I was more of a 5th edition game master, and a lot of the advice is kind of written towards, I think, 5e style game masters, but it really focuses on sort of that quote unquote lazy style of preparation where you don't over prep your games. And I think a lot of that can apply to an OSR style mindset and an OSR style referee. So we're going to be taking a look at the book and what it contains, but with a mindset of an OSR GM. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Okay, so here we have the Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master by Mike Shea. Kind of a cool artwork on the front. It's a hardcover book. Here's the back cover. Prepare what benefits your game. Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is a book designed to help game masters of all kinds to get more out of our role-playing games by preparing less. Sounds good to me. Mike does a really nice job of writing briefly and succinctly. It sort of gives you the information you need and you move on to the next chapter and section. That's really nice, especially if you're buying a book about being a lazy dungeon master. You don't want to read a whole lot. So gives good advice in a nice condensed format. Intro kind of about this book. Table of contents there. It is 29 chapters, but written over 86 pages. So most are a page or two before going to the next one. So first section is preparing for your game. Chapter 1 talks about the way of the lazy dungeon master. Just sort of gives some introductory information there. So here we get to the meat of it in chapter 2, sort of the checklist, that'll highlight the future chapters within the section. We have reviewing the characters, create a strong start, outline potential scenes, define secrets and clues, develop fantastic locations, outline important NPCs, choose relevant monsters, and select magic item rewards. And the rest of this chapter is just sort of briefly talking about those different ideas. Then you get to the review characters chapter. And this is sort of talking about look at your player characters as you're prepping for your game. Understand who they are as characters. What are their goals and ambitions? I think some of it is definitely applicable to the OSR. Some of it I think leans a little bit more towards grand story arcs type campaigns, which are definitely more of a modern edition focus. But I think it's still usable advice from an OSR perspective. Creating a strong start. So he talks about here, when you're starting off your game session, get your players some sort of action right off the bat. That's to sort of create interest in the session and get everybody invested and involved. I think this advice is good with caution. So he talks about starting with combat. In the OSR, I would definitely not force combat. I would maybe have some sort of encounter where your players could make decisions. Do they want to fight? Maybe they see a group of like a roaming patrol, they can hide from it, something like that. So you can start with some sort of tension and action, but I wouldn't start with combat in a forced perspective within an OSR style game where they are much more fragile. He gives some examples of strong starts. So maybe 10 suits of animated armor of a style not seen for 1,000 years interrupt the local lord's address and issue a challenge to a queen long dead. Okay, that is an example of one that necessarily doesn't have to end in combat. So that's cool. That's a good way to sort of create strong starts for your sessions. Nothing wrong with that advice. Outline potential scenes. So again, I think this is with the focus of your players going on adventures. In the OSR, your players definitely can go on quests or adventures. It might not be as sort of grand or arcing as you might see in a modern edition, but if your players are asked by the local witch to go into a cave to get some sort of fungi, that's a quest, and there might be some different scenes that happen along the way. A little bit mixed reception from an OSR mindset here. I think I would say focus more on the locations, focus on the different, ideas that your players have, sort of their ambitions and what they've set, what they're looking to do in your next session, and kind of go off of that. So if you consider those scenes, then I think outlining them is good. Otherwise, don't focus too much on the story aspect of it. That'll come naturally. Define secrets and clues. So this one is interesting, and one that I have kind of liked and tried to use throughout my years as a game master. So his idea here is that you write a list of different clues that might pop up in your upcoming session, and you kind of abstract them from people, places, or things. So when your players run into something, they get some information from a goblin that you didn't foresee ahead of time. You can look at your list of secrets and clues that you've written for the session and take one of those and apply it to, like, that's what the goblin knows. I do like that, sort of get in the mindset of different clues and secrets that your players might come into. From the OSR perspective, I'm not sure how much I would abstract them. It might just be nice when you design your dungeons or your locations, just pepper them with clues and secrets in them. And if your players find them and uncover them, that's great. If they don't, well, they aren't always revealed, and that's not a big deal. So to me, if you're writing clues and you're abstract, you don't really need to abstract them. Just apply them to different creatures or locations in your prep. And I think that's a fine way to go about it too. Let me know if you like the abstraction idea or not in the comments. Develop fantastic locations. So he talks about starting with an evocative name, figuring out some interesting aspects about it, what makes it fantastic, and he gives some lists there. Again, I think great advice. You as a OSR referee, locations are one of your kind of main staples that you have to offer to your players. So making those evocative areas that they can go and interact with, awesome. Great advice. Definitely, think about that when you are developing your sessions. Something like, when you think about modules like the incandescent grottos or the halls of the Blood King, those are evocative names. They have a lot of different interactive elements that are going on in them. Very good advice here. Outline important NPCs. I agree with this. If you have NPCs that are central to locations, then think about what they have to offer, what they're doing there, what can they offer your players, or what sort of obstacles do they offer to your players as well. So, thinking about NPCs, solid advice, would recommend that. Choosing relevant monsters. So again, if you're developing a location or maybe an adventure in an OSR style game, you're going to have monsters. Again, think about the relevant ones. If they're going in a crypt, they're probably going to face undead. If they're going to a castle or a fortress, whoever occupies that castle or fortress, you're going to encounter a lot of those there. He talks about challenge ratings. Of course, that is more of a modern concept. Hit die is essentially a replacement for that in old school type games. But the advice here I still think applies to OSR. So, don't worry too much about the hit die creatures that you're putting in your adventures. Obviously, if your players are low level, don't stock the dungeon with only high level hit die creatures. But there can be, if it's a party of first level characters, there could maybe be an 8 hit die creature in there. That's just something that the players have to deal with in a non-combat way. In that regard, thinking of balance loosely, I totally agree with. Select magic item rewards. I probably wouldn't do a wish list per se for players, but you could, if your players are interested in that or want specific items, you could stock that. I don't see anything wrong with that. Choosing items randomly, I like to do that if my players come across some sort of random encounter or random like monster lair, then I'll roll for the treasure based off of the treasure tables within Old School Essentials or BX or whatever system you're using. But I like this, tie magic items to the story. So again, in this case, story, I would say more setting in the OSR. Our preparation so far, it's fine. And then he talks about reducing the checklist. And then it goes on to other high value prep activities. I think all of these can apply in an OSR game. I don't see anything wrong with that. Handouts, maps, or artwork. Lazy Dungeon Master's Toolkit, reskinning. Great advice. I see it in the OSR all the time. I think there was a famous article, if I can remember it, I'll put it in the comments, something like everything's a bear or just use bears. I forget the name of it, but essentially, reskin your monsters. Just use stat blocks that you're familiar with and building a lazy campaign. So this is, he talks about developing the spiral campaign. So this means kind of like starting small and spiraling out from that. I think that is great advice. Build the campaign hook. Nothing wrong with that in an OSR game. You can have sort of an overarching threat or something looming, like kill the vampire lord and end her reign of darkness. Maybe your players are on like a Ravenloft type sandbox or something like that. Nothing wrong with having an overarching hook, I don't think. You don't need one in an OSR style game, but if you want to have one, state the 6 truths of your world. So these are just things that help define your world and your campaign to your players. Define fronts. So he borrows this from the game Dungeon World. And fronts are essentially a way to have factions or powerful individuals have sort of goals and ambitions and sort of move them forward. When I have my sandbox OSR games, I like having factions that have goals that are visible to your players. You could definitely use a front system if you want. I've used a few different things, but nothing wrong with this advice if you want to have sort of that dynamic world in your OSR game as your players are interacting with it. Running session 0. Next section is all about running your game at the table. So top traits of good game masters, summarize the previous sessions, 3 tricks for group storytelling. So describe your killing blow, a little bit of flavor, seems fine, don't have to do it. Then these others are maybe a little bit, maybe I personally wouldn't do, but I don't see anything wrong with it per se. So asking your players what interesting physical characteristics of the monster are, or the location, things like that. Asking them what happens along the journey. In an old school game, your travel is a large part of the sandbox, right? So what they do on the journey is the actual fiction in the game and the emerging story. In a modern game, it's very possible that you just hand wave weeks of travel to get to the dungeon, because 5th edition trivializes travel challenges unlike an OSR style game does. So probably not something I would use in an OSR style game. Group world building improvisation, I think you can use that. That's fine. As a game master myself, I like to have a little bit more of a defined world, and then my players are the ones that get to interact and break things within it. So that's just my own personal preference. But if you want to do group world building, there's nothing wrong with that. Improvising NPCs makes sense. Do that all the time in any style of game. Improvising scenes and situations makes sense. You do that in OSR games too. I think with this one thing that I really like in OSR games that you might not have as much access to in core rule books of like a 5th edition is the reaction rules. You can improvise a lot of scenes or situations based off of random encounters, reaction rules, morale checks, things like that are a lot of sort of procedural tools to an OSR game master a 5th edition player might not have, and this type of advice might be more useful for them. Whereas you as an OSR GM, if you're using those reaction roles and things like that, it kind of writes itself for you, and the improvisation becomes a lot easier. Multiple combat styles, maintaining the pace. So again, I think this is a little bit more focused on modern games. You can these are good questions to ask, like what do you do? But if you're if you're playing basic expert and you're in a dungeon, I mean, dungeon turns are going on every turn. Players they get an option on what they want to do. So these things are a lot more straightforward handling. And it talks a little bit about improvising, understanding upward and downward beats and improvising them. Again, and I would probably shy away from this in an OSR style game, because if you're rolling random encounters, well, those are going to be your up beats. If you force combat because you've been on sort of a downward or a more low key trend in your session, that could end very badly for your players and not something I would do. Whereas in a 5th edition game, if you force a combat, your players are probably going to survive and be just fine. Thinking about your game is the next section. So priming the GM's brain. So he talks about, read books, watch movies, TV shows, play video games, read comics, things like that. A lot of different ways to think about your game, take in different fiction to learn ideas. Classic advice going back to Appendix N in the 1st edition Advanced Dungeon Masters, conducting GM brain exercises. I think these are good thought exercises that you can think about in a sandbox or an OSR style game. So what are what are villains or NPCs? What are the major factions in your campaign doing right now? How are those fronts on the move? Just sort of think about how is the world living and going on as your players do whatever they're doing. Makes a lot of sense, and it's good advice. Embracing the GM truths. So everyone's here to have fun, of course. Players don't care as much as you think. Want to see their characters do awesome things, and you're not the enemy. They love breaking the game. All great advice, even in an OSR game. Lazy Dungeon Master tricks, award levels instead of XP. I would not do that in an OSR game. Improvise abilities and skill checks. Not too many of those in old school games, depending on your game of choice, of course. Skipping initiatives. I wouldn't use static monster damage either. It's deadly enough. Roll for it. If your player's character survives, they survive. If it's a high number, that's just the luck of the draw, luck of the dice, and you can roll up another character in 5 minutes. Final thoughts, developing your own style. Yeah, make your game your own. Lean into the things that you like to do and enjoy. If you have passion for it, your players will see that and they'll enjoy it. So don't be too hard on yourself as you figure out your own style. He did some surveys to kind of learn about how GMs prep and think. I'm not going to go through any of the results here. They were done back in 2016, so fairly old now, but maybe still apply. And then additional references and reading, and just some advertisements on the back, I think. So that is the book. Overall, I do think a lot of the advice is nice. It's succinct. It holds up to an OSR style gameplay. Some of it you can ignore if you play old school games rather than sort of a 5th edition game. But those are my thoughts. I think it's a good book if you're looking for a way to, handle and master your prep and you want to make it sort of a minimalist style. He uses the Lazy Dungeon Master tag. I don't want to say it's a clickbait title, but it's kind of a catchy title that attracts it. But lazy isn't necessarily the right way to think about it. It's, you're minimizing the time that you're spending, but you can still spend a lot of your brain energy thinking about your game and giving care and love to it. So you're by no means lazy if you're just doing an hour worth of prep. You're just prepping smart. So that is it for me. I will leave links down in the description on where you can find the book if you'd like to check it out. Thanks for watching. Give it a like if you enjoyed this review and thoughts on sort of OSR style play with this book. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.